Great. Okay, so hi everybody, and thank you for joining our second meeting dealing with collection management systems and digital assets management for a museum. Today we are going to focus on the future of collection management systems. At our previous meeting, we heard about systems that are being used in Israel and around the world. And it seems that there isn't any perfect one. So today we are going to hear from Nik Honeysett. I pronounce it right?
Perfect. Perfect.
Great. About the future of collection management systems, to which direction systems are going to be developed, and what we should do when, or notice or think about when we choose one. Nik is the CEO of the Balboa Park Online Collaborative, a San Diego-based non-profit consultancy that provide IT support, development, and digital strategy for museum and cultural institutions. Previously, he was head of administration for the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. And formerly, he led the Getty Web Group. And before moving to Los Angeles, he was the head of the production at CogPap, a UK-based consultancy specializing in interactive and online multimedia for cultural sector in Europe and in the USA. He's a former board of the American Alliance of Museums and the Museum Computer Network, and is currently board president of the Institute for Learning Innovation. So you can leave a question at the chat, and we will have time at the end. And Nik, you are most invited, and thank you again for the lecture.
Thank you, Efrat. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm coming to you from San Diego, which is the southernmost city in California, just across from the Mexican border. So today, I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully everybody can see that. A thumbs up. Excellent. So this I want to talk to you about, it's going to be in two parts, this talk. So one, I'm going to share with you a study that we did around collections management systems, kind of in response to a similar situation that you're in, which is, what should we be thinking about for collections management systems? What is the technology landscape? And a whole slew of questions around. It's a survey and a report, and I'll give you access to that. So it's going to be a little more technical around collections management systems, about acquiring them, about what's important about them. And then the second part is going to be much more exciting. I'm going to kind of talk about the kind of evolving needs for collections management, from which it won't come as a surprise to you, is all about accessibility and discoverability of your collections. So let me start here. Okay, so this is a study. It was done about just before the pandemic. There's a fair amount of detail in it. So this is a snapshot of what's going on in the USA. I think a lot of it may be relevant to you, and I'm sure you'll be able to pick up some things around it. And partly this study was done because there really is a shared challenge when we think about collections management systems, which is there are evolving expectations, right? And so as collecting institutions, the reason that we exist is for the collection. And we hold that collection, certainly in the US, in the public trust. And so we are required to give the public access to those collections. Archives, whether it's academic, in an academic situation, whether it's a museum, whether it's an archive, and you'll see there's some actually emerging requirements about supporting collaboratively archives and the academic community. So we have a digital savvy audience now, increasingly wanting to consume stuff primarily online, but we have emerging expectations and evolving expectations from internal constituents. So as collections managers, you are required to partner and collaborate with a whole host of departments around your institution. So the survey that we did was in 7 parts. There were 70 questions, and these were the broad topics around it. So what type, who's filling it in, what type of institution, information about the collection, then information about how the collections management system was selected, how it was implemented, what kind of support it gets, and then some strategic thoughts around collections management writ large in the institution. So we had around 200 respondents, about 220, I think. So you can see primarily art museums responded to the survey, followed by history and then archives. And then you can see this kind of descending list of museum disciplines that are represented in this study. So 214 responses. To get a sense of how large these institutions were, 9% were under $100,000 annual budget, about a quarter were over 25 million, so some large institutions. A small percentage were very large, having over 1,000 staff members. And in the US, there's this concept of the small museum, which is a museum that has up to 5 full-time staff and an annual budget of about $500,000. And so it's kind of a recognized category of museums. And then there are some kind of average and combined stats around total staff, total combined budget, and total combined collection that is represented by this study. So you can see a combined collection of about 18.6 million objects. So these were the kinds of things we're talking about. This is the order I'm going to go through the results. So talking about digitization, so particularly if you're looking to get your collections online, which again is an increasing requirement, I'm sure it is for you too. What is the state of digitization? What does collections online look like? What about access and integration? So these were key themes that came up as a result of the study. Efrat talked about digital asset management previously, and you'll see that is a big requirement for integrating with your collections management system. And then some information about selection strategy. And then I'll share with you some kind of broad themes that came out of the study. There was an opportunity to apply some narrative to the questions. And then I picked out a few choice quotes. So this study is available, the link up here, you'll get these links. This is actually a link to this presentation. So everything you're seeing today, you'll have access to. So let's talk about digitization. So this is an interesting graph of the state. So we've captured kind of 4 categories. So the blue represents percentage of your collection for which you have no digital representation. So it's all analog. There's nothing, there's no reference images, there's nothing. The red is just purely analog. So you have absolutely nothing. The green is you've digitized high-res images, and the yellow is you digitize low-res images. So you can see approximately half, there's no analog or no digital representation. And when I talk about analog, I'm talking about slides or transparencies. So, which would be a starting point for a digitization program. So out of the survey, 3/4 of respondents were digitizing less than 1,000 objects a year. Most of them were reshooting, right? Because the evolving needs for quality images weren't represented by what the institutions already had. So they were shooting from originals. About a half had what we would recognize as unmanaged digital assets. So not in a domain-specific environment like a digital asset management system, but probably on a file server somewhere, so unmanaged. In terms of collections, we see that the collections were increasing, the size of the collections, so the acquisition was about 1% a year. So the size of the collections were increasing about 1% per year. And cataloging and digitization rates were about 1.5% per year. So you can see just a small amount of incremental progress is being made when institutions are cataloging and digitizing. In the US, there are about 35,000 museums. And so these figures represent if you think about how large these collections are, or in total, the rate of cataloging and digitization, you can do a simple calculation to say that it's going to take 4,500 years to actually digitize and catalog everything so probably not going to happen. Even despite that, 2/3 of museums said eventually they wanted to digitize everything. And I'll just say what a fantastically optimistic desire that is. Okay, what about collections online? So, as institutions, we manage a collections management system. Emergingly needs to do two things. One, it needs to manage the collections. Again, the reason we exist is the collection and the resources. It's critical that resources are applied to support the management of that collection. And increasingly, nowadays that is through software and technology. So what are museums doing to get their collections online? So again, this is another breakdown. So about 10%, less than 10% have 100% of their collections online. For about half the respondents, they have less than 10% of their collections online. And that's kind of a little similar to the public display of our collection. So if you look at the percentage of a collection that is actually physically on display, it's a very tiny percentage. 10% would be significant, often, and it's a 1 or 2% range. So for 3/4 of respondents, less than 20% of their collection is on view. So again, the irony is that we're holding collections in the public trust, but the public is not having full access to them. So for 2/3 of respondents, less than 10% of their objects have any kind of educational or interpretive copy with them. So just tombstone information, potentially an image too. For 40% of people who have their collections online, the way they're doing it is through a module baked into the collections management system itself. So some of the larger, certainly in the US, some of the larger collections management systems have these modules. So if you're familiar with TMS from Gallery Systems, they have what's called eMuseum, which is allows you to create an online copy. Past Perfect, which has the largest installed base of collections of institutions for a collections management system, which is about 1/3 of the total museums in the US. Past Perfect has Past Perfect Online, so it's a relatively easy route to get your institution, your collection online. For about 2/3 of the respondents, they only have highlights of their collection. So they are not providing access to their entire collection. They're cherry picking the highlights, the key objects, which may be on their website, or they're using social media to share information about objects. And so when we delved a little deeper into, is there a plan to get your collections online? This was a typical response. We've been talking about this for a long time. We thought it should have happened by now. It hasn't, for whatever reason. A lot of desire to provide collections online, but there's no plan. Often talked about, but no real resources put behind actually effecting that strategy to provide access. And so really, originally when the web came along, a lot of museums saw the internet as an opportunity to get their collections online. So there was a promise of using digital to provide greater access to collections, but that is not really happening right now, certainly in the US. What's going on? Okay, so what about access and integration? So here is, let's zoom into this chart. For this question, it was what best describes your institution's policy with getting things online. So some institutions have collections for which they don't have the rights to put them online. And then there are ways around that. Certainly under US law, there's the notion of a thumbnail, which allows you to, if you don't have the rights, it gets you across the legality of being able to display it. So we have these kind of categories of being, you are being protected of your ability to provide these things online. A fair proportion, almost 20%, have high resolution, but for non-commercial use. High resolution based on rights, which is the orange chart. And then this small pink one here, unrestricted. So there are a number of seemingly, certainly from respondents of a number of institutions that are just making their collections available through open access. And I'll talk about that in the second part, and oftentimes for commercial use. So the institution is saying, you know, we can't, we're not making enough money from rights and reproductions of licensing our images. You know, it's costing us more for the person to actually do it than the revenue that we actually get. So we may as well just make our collections available for open access. So low resolution thumbnails dominate the collections online kind of world, 7% unrestricted for commercial use. 40% when we talk about metadata. So, you know, discoverability online, not only from the tombstone information, but, you know, metadata assigned to your collection objects that would allow you to kind of expose those things online through metadata. 40% of institutions have less than 10% of records that have metadata designed for access for the general public or maybe scholars. In terms of putting information in, so I don't know if you're familiar with the Getty vocabularies over here. So a number of collections management systems support, and I'll put that in inverted quotes, they support the implementation of controlled access into fields. So leveraging thesauri, leveraging vocabularies, but that is not well integrated into collections management systems. Oftentimes, it's a one-shot kind of import the thesaurus or import the vocabulary, and it's up to you, even though those systems, those vocabularies, those thesauri are growing on a daily basis, there's no direct link. And oftentimes, institutions will do that once when they purchase a CMS, and then it will never happen again. We also found that 90% of collections management installations were on-premise. So they were on a file server somewhere in the institution itself. I don't know what the numbers, since the pandemic, when many institutions became a lot more comfortable with the cloud, it'll be interesting to see whether that percentage has shifted. I kind of suspect not, certainly from our working with museums, and we support a fair number of museums here in Balboa Park. We would just provide what's called VPN, so virtual private network access to the collections management system while it was still on premise. Public access and discovery are still kind of works in progress. So when we asked institutions, you know, what are the key systems that you want to integrate your collections management system with, a web content management was by far the largest one. And I think that kind of goes back to those requirements, strategic requirements around getting our collections online is a priority for us now. So that was a short-term priority for them. And then, Ifrat, you mentioned digital asset management systems earlier. So digital asset management systems and preservation systems were the top two for long-term priorities. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that later. So what about selection? So this is an interesting chart. I'll just zoom into it so you can see it here. And there's kind of a worrying thing about this, which speaks to the need for a very formal process in how you select a collections management system for your institution. So you can see the purple line, staff involved in the selection were dominated by collection staff. Great, so they made up the team. But we saw that for 50% of all respondents, the staff who had originally worked on the selection process had now left. And part of the challenge, as you'll see here, is that there's a lack of institutional knowledge and recorded knowledge about why a particular system was selected. Also worrying, the final decision, a third of people were not sure, a quarter was by leadership. And the notion behind that is that it was in the end a financial decision, right? So rather than collection staff selecting a collections management system that is based on their needs, the scope, their requirement, in the end it comes down to leadership who are more than likely making a decision based on finances rather than meeting the full suite of recommendations and requirements for your content management systems. Only 25% followed a formal process. And I think this is the most concerning thing, certainly for me, because the majority of the selection process was either collections manager coming in and saying, well, I used to use this one, you should use this collections management system, or other informal methods of just asking colleagues, you know, what collections management system do you use? Okay, we'll look at that one. That's not to say that that doesn't work out sometimes, but the challenge is that going through the process of selection, a formal kind of RFP process, requires that you document your scope and your requirements and your needs, but it also requires that you look to the future about, well, what are we going to need in 3 to 5 years' time? Because you're not really purchasing a system, and this really goes for any application. You're not purchasing it for where you are now, you're purchasing it for where you want to be and where you want to go to. So it's important to know those things. So, like I said, half the staff involved departed, and there's a lack of formal matching of the requirements to the actual product that you're going to end up using. And most people were frustrated with the system that they have. And I think that really speaks to the process that was adopted in order to bring that system in. What about strategy? So this is really around collections management in general. So cataloging, digitization, those kinds of things. You know, are there specific strategies? So you can see here for 50%, it was just broad collections management institutional goals. So just a very general direction for collections management. 40% had specific goals, but unassigned resources. So even though they had a desire to do some particular strategic things, there was no money or people to be able to affect them. Only 16% had specific goals and a genuinely resourced plan, right? Here's a plan for our strategy, its tactics, and it's budgeted and scheduled. For 2/3 of respondents, they had been managing collections electronically for more than 15 years, and a half had had the same collections management system for 10 years or more. That's not to say that that's a bad thing. If you have a collections management vendor that has a roadmap of functional improvement and updates, then that's fine. But if you, which again, this should be part of a process of selection, is, you know, what is your roadmap? Are you going to grow this product as our needs grow? Are your needs grow? And certainly in the US, collections management systems are dominated by 3 or 4 large companies who really have a monopoly, and there's no real reason for them to be advancing the functionality if it's going to cost them. And so I'll shamelessly promote a webinar series that we did called Dreaming of a Collections Management System, where we were trying to raise the profile of some of the emerging smaller native cloud collections management system providers who, while the functionality they have right now may not match some of the incumbents, they are certainly on a much more aggressive roadmap. You know, the architecture of their systems is much more nimble, it's much more modular, it's much more agile, and they're in a much better position to more quickly grow with functionality that is required as we think about the future of collections management systems. The summary for this slide really is there's a disconnect between collections management strategy and actually the ability and even the commitment on the part of an institution to support that strategy. So some broad general themes. Collections management system. Increasingly, if you look how a collections management system is being used in an institution, it's more than just managing collection information, right? It's a key productivity tool, right? So if you have a digitization initiative, then out of your collections management system is coming, you know, a shot list, you know, so it's driving productivity and workflow around the organization. You know, if you're doing an exhibition, you know, probably you start off with, you know, an exhibition list, you know, that's coming out of your collections management system. So it really does need to be thought of as more of a productivity work tool for the entire institution, because the institution largely revolves around collections management. Half of institutions want to replace their collections management system. You know, some of them, they clearly are frustrated with it, but oftentimes they struggle to make the case. While they may want to do it, they are not making an effective case to their leadership to support that, that switch. And oftentimes, as they contemplate switching or migrating to a new system, the pain of using the tool is less than the pain of switching. And you see so that kind of migration process, that process of taking, how you've had to kind of potentially shoehorn your collections information into your system, just contemplating what it's going to take to kind of go through that process is perceived to be too much. And so you'll see some of the new emerging collections management vendors providing, taking on the challenge of helping you with that migration. So they will do, a couple in particular who have built a suite of tools that much more efficiently and elegantly will extract your collections information and import it into their system. So they're trying to reduce that barrier of switching. So it's kind of a hostage situation. Oftentimes there are, particularly the large monopoly collections management systems, they don't want to provide you with elegant integration tools to integrate with the web CMS, for example, or a digital asset management system, because if they make it easy for you to integrate with another system, they make it easy for you to get that information out, and they don't want you to do that. And that's the irony. One of the big ironies of what we found was the museums want to be able to do this. They want to be able to integrate more elegantly with these systems, and the reason they want to switch is because the vendor won't provide that elegant integration mechanism. So it's kind of a catch-22. A couple of quotes that came out of this: sustainable, more widely used open source museum collections management solutions are needed to compete with the monopoly that's currently taking hold. There are some particular vendors that were called out to say that they do have a monopoly and they've made no innovation, or if they have, it's been really slow. They're just trying to create more reasons for you to increase your license and maintenance fee. Certainly that's a perception. And then the overarching need, a flexible system, right? That's going to expand, it's going to evolve to meet your needs. These are key requirements. And there is a huge desire for museums to better partner with their vendors and have them keep pace with their emerging requirements. But there is a reluctance on the part of the vendor to do that. A couple of projects that you might be interested in, which are institutions trying to push the frontiers of integrations and providing, creating access to collections. And this is really kind of a transition to part two. We're going to talk about accessibility. So the Getty, big open access projects, Georgia O'Keeffe, big linked open data. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but just big initiatives to expose the information that they have to kind of break out of the confines of the collections management system that's holding a tight control on the information, and just make it broadly available in the hopes that other people can, use that data to create their own kind of increasingly valuable network of collections. There's a link here I've put. One of the most recent ones is the Philadelphia Museum of Art, who just did a big project around art and information commons to, again, use linked open data to provide greater access to their collection. So summarizing the report, and provide you a link to the actual written report. So certainly in the US, Field is looking for a different, more advanced, scalable and flexible solution, certainly around what the current technology landscape is. Such a solution is one that's going to be evolving with their needs, providing greater access, greater integration, and greater collections discovery. So these are the kind of key emerging traits as museums are increasingly pressured to provide access to the collections, again, that I said are held in the public trust. So a couple of summary problems and solutions. A lot of, we saw some data around this of institutions keeping their collections management systems online, on premise, emerging solutions are fully cloud native, right? They are a service that you just subscribe to. So rather than this old way of, well, we need 3-seat license for our collections management system, it's going to sit on a file server in this room. It's more about, as we are seeing everything evolve to this software as a service. So it's just a service, you pay a monthly fee, and you have access, everybody has access to it. So there are less constraints and less kind of roadblocks to providing certainly internal access. Emerging, being able to see what the collections management system looks like before you buy it. So a try before you buy as part of a selection process. Some collections management vendors will just let you upload, a subsection of your collection and just play around with it. They'll give you 30 days access to do whatever you want. And then again, this whole notion of migration, solution vendors are providing you with kind of an evaluation of what it would take to migrate, and they'll take on that migration task for you. So we are at about halfway through. So there was a lot of information there. You're going to have links to this study so you can do, so you can look at it in your own time. So we could either pause for maybe 10 minutes and have some questions about this, or I can kind of go on to part 2, just like I said, much more exciting. And then we can save questions for right till the end.
So anyone have any question for this part, or? Okay.
You all want to get to the exciting. You all want to get to the exciting bit, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's take a kind of a different look at collections management. So. Okay. So one of the key requirements, again, that's us. Accessibility, right? One of the biggest drivers, are certainly in the US, around collections management systems is accessibility. And it's really accessibility on both sides. How accessible is your collections management system internally for the staff who need to use it? And how accessible is it to the general public, who really, from a mission standpoint, should be providing access to it? And oftentimes, you'll see that for museums who have their collections online, internal staff will use the online version to find information about the collection rather than the internal collections management system itself. Sometimes those are kind of licensing seat issues, but sometimes it's a lot easier to search and discover, information about, your own collection online than it is to actually use the collections management system that you have. So this is kind of another way of looking at it. So there's this kind of equation that we work with around collections management systems. There's a changing audience expectation, right? People want to see things, even if they're if someone's going to come and visit you, they're going to go to your website. They're going to look at, what do you have? So there are changing audience expectations. There's also changing internal expectations, right? You, as an internal, as an organization, you want to provide more, you want to integrate with your digital asset management system. You want to become more technical savvy with the environment in which your collections management sits. The problem with those two things are offset by, you have legacy systems. You often have legacy infrastructure that you're dealing with. So you have an old, a collections management system that you can't host in the cloud, for example. And then you have institutional inertia, right? You have, and we saw that from the previous study, of lots of desire to change and evolve, but no resources applied to it. And really what we need to be doing, so these are key kind of, as we think about the future of collections management systems, what are the requirements? Educating the public with your collection, certainly that is a key mission-driven requirement, certainly in the US. Empowering people with it, we're seeing these increasing, certainly from a decolonization perspective in the US, empowering the public with a certainly underserved community with the collections that they are being held. how do we activate and how do we motivate people with collections? So those are increasingly seen as institutions think about what's driving investment in collections management. So what does this mean? It means access and discovery are key requirements. So it's as much about management, so the tools to actually manage information about the collection, as it is about providing access and discovery to them. So if I mentioned at the beginning, we're strategic consultants around here. So we have these notions of kind of where institutions are on a spectrum of an initiative, on a philosophy, on a strategy. And so you saw in that previous presentation, I mentioned a couple of things around control and revolutionary. And so this is really based on this kind of 5 levels of kind of philosophy for an institution. And so you can see here a conservative, so when you think about this around collections discovery, right? So we saw a lot of institutions do not have their collections online. So they're really at this far left-hand side of being very conservative about providing access and discovery. They're not, right? If you want to see the collections, you've got to visit the institution. So at one end of this spectrum, it's a very traditional, it's restrictive, it's protected, you know, maybe it's a thumbnail in that is available online. Next up is a confident approach. So you're providing access, but you're controlling it. Kind of emerging, what we would regard as emerging practice is bold. And then visionary is, you know, what are you doing with your collections online that is cutting edge? I think somebody should be muted. So visionary, right? A few examples in the field of how people are providing discovery for their collections. It's a topic of thought leadership and discussion, or it's revolutionary, right? So it's institutions thinking really at the advanced edge of what it means to provide access and discoverability to your collection. These are just conversations that people are having, and there's probably no examples out there. So this is kind of the gamut of the spectrum of philosophy around collections. So these are also kind of protect, you're controlling, you're open to providing access, you're activating, and you're motivating. So these translate to, if you have an online presence, selected highlights, maybe you have tombstone information, you have low resolution, and maybe you just have a search box. And a search box is a fantastically difficult interface for most people to use, which you'll see coming up, to discover your collections. Control, you have comprehensive online access, you have high resolution images if available, you have basic metadata, and you may have thematic groupings. In the middle, you may have extended metadata, so you're now really doing a good effort in opening up the collections to the internet, to particularly from a search engine, external search engine standpoint. You may have provenance information, you may have exhibition history, you may have high resolution details, you may be doing open access, you know, providing the entire collection for anybody to download and use. And you may have deep dive interpretive content. So you may pick out highlights of the collection and provide deep dive interpretive content through them. Some of those examples I showed you previously, Philadelphia, the Getty, the Georgia O'Keeffe, are now some emerging examples of really kind of making your information truly available. So it's to support the semantic web, if you're familiar with that, linked open data. This notion of generous interfaces, right? I'm going to talk about that term in a minute. Maybe you're providing research tools, you know, so you're supporting an academic community and you're actually providing some tools online that may allow academics, researchers to do comparisons between images, for example, or to see X-ray versions, and there's some elegant interfaces that I'll share with you. Some providing, you know, visitor comments on those. Or maybe you're right at this front-end revolutionary level. You're doing front-end integration, you're doing back-end integration, you're doing cross-repository, so you're connecting your archives, your preservation system, you're connecting these systems behind the scenes with your collections management system at the center. You're thinking of much more novel and engaging ways to draw attention to your collection. Maybe you're choosing highlights, but the idea is that really you're trying to pique people's interest in your entire collections. Maybe you're doing something with social curation, and maybe you're using analytics to actually help you understand how the public is using your collection. So some institutions use data of viewing of particular collection objects or particular themes of collections to determine what their digitization strategy might be or what their interpretation strategy might be. So they're trying to derive what is the interest in our collection, and let's focus our attention on that when we think about providing greater access. I'll just note that, what is now visionary and revolutionary, this scale is always moving to the left, right? It used to be, for those of us who are old enough to remember before the internet, it used to be that as a museum, having a website was this revolutionary idea, right? Why would we put up our collections on a website? Now it's understood that you should have one. So some of these things that you're seeing on the visionary and revolutionary scale really need to be in your sites as requirements for a collections management system and how you might support access and discovery. So I did a little, when we think about our collections online, this is just a little kind of snapshot of data. It's kind of really an update to that previous survey. I'm using Past Perfect. You may be familiar with that collections management system. Like I said, it accounts for about 1/3 of the collections management systems in the US. And they publish, and it's a voluntary, it's not an exhaustive list, but they publish the institutions that have their collections management system and the institutions that are using an add-on module to get those collections online. And you can see it's about 19% of the institutions that have that collections management system that are putting their collections online, making them available. And you'll see for each of these slides, the reason I'm going to share this slide deck with you is there's pretty much every slide has at least one link where you can actually see what I'm talking about. I have a lot of examples. We don't have time to go through them, but I'm providing links to them. So when we think about access and discovery, the search box is kind of the go-to, certainly for the vendors that provide an online module. Really all they provide is a search box. And that is, it kind of requires that anybody who's about to type into that search box understands what's behind it, right? So when faced with a search box, what do you type to find it? Unless you're a researcher, unless you have prior knowledge of what the collection might entail, you have no idea what to type. And oftentimes you get back, if you do know that, you get back these no results shown. It's a very unforgiving way of providing access, right? It doesn't even, if you spell something wrong, or if you don't type in the right term, you type in impressionism instead of impressionist, maybe you don't get anything. So it's a very unforgiving way of providing access. Again, these are, you'll see links here. The difference between what an institution is providing, right? So this is a slightly more advanced from the Oakland Museum of California. So they're providing a search box, but they're also providing these other interesting things. They're providing an index of makers. They're providing an index of collections terms, a browsable way of, from a more, certainly from a more academic standpoint, but then they're also putting together these kind of collections and providing kind of thematic ways of doing it. Up to a point, it still requires some kind of knowledge. But pretty much for every out-of-the-box collections management online module, it's less functional than just being able to go to Google, and you can see in the bottom right here, you can tell Google to search for something on a particular website. So you can see that you say, search for impressionism here on this website, and it will give you this much better, well, why don't we just do it? So you can see here, so this is Google. So I could use Oakland Museum of Art's collection search box. It's not very forgiving. or I could do this with Google. And what you'll see here is this is a great indication of how you should tag and label your collection objects, because Google, even though these are all distinct collection objects, Google is pulling the title from the metadata, and it's less informative. It's the accession number. It would be much more productive if that was the title. Okay. So again, providing access to collections. You know, how do you raise the profile of your collection? The way Google works is if you can increase presence, if you can create inbound traffic, right? So if the more people that come to your website, the more Google will think you are important, right? And your collection, if you have a museum website, the collection probably represents the largest kind of mass of information on your website. So that's where people who are searching for things probably are going to land. So you need to do as a greater job as you can in providing access to that. So maybe you go to other websites where you are sharing information about the collection, maybe something like Wikipedia, which is a great way of providing and raising the profile of your collection, because you've got this inbound traffic coming in, which increases how Google thinks about you. Lots of institutions, again, you have access to here. So I said about these kind of more interesting ways of providing access and discoverability to your collections. And, you know, what does that mean for a collections management system? So this is the Art Institute of Chicago. They are doing some experimentation and examples with what's known as a technology called IIIF, which is really just a very functional way to manipulate images. And so what I'll share with you here is, so here we have two images of a collection object, its address, and it's been X-rayed. And so what I can do is I can say, we'll put these two images together, right? Because again, this is a great research tool. And so what I can do is if I roll my mouse over this image, it's now creating transparency with the X-ray and the collection object. It's a great research tool. We're starting to see this emerge in collections presentation, but we're also seeing, so this technology called IIIF, we're also seeing this becoming available inside collections management systems, right? So providing greater functionality to the actual system itself to support internal staff. So I know, I think TMS are looking at this, and there are a couple of other, I think Axial may be looking at this, but much more functional tools in providing insight into collection objects. And increasingly, as these demands are coming out and these requirements, this functionality is going to be embedded into collections management systems. So there's a link there to IIIF if you wanted to take a look at that. So I mentioned generous interfaces, right? So this is to kind of get around that search box, which is, like I said, unforgiving, but it's providing different ways of interacting with a collection. So here we can see just a simple timeline of objects. You know, the only way that these timelines can work from a functional standpoint is, you know, if you have accuracy and you are conforming to some standards in object creation dates, right? So, you know, having, you know, if you have an object that maybe has a range of dates, or it's a circa, or you don't really know, those things aren't going to work with these kinds of generous interfaces, right? You need to be pretty explicit on what the date of creation is for an object, but it can create these elegant interfaces. Here's another example from an art collection. There's a couple of emerging, when we think about that kind of right-hand term, the visionary stuff, the revolutionary stuff, what's known as linked open data. There are emerging, this is definitely on the revolutionary side, this is the Met. And so the Met is starting to use artificial intelligence. It's starting to think about connecting objects and artists together so that you can actually have these kind of navigate these routes through collection objects. So behind the scenes, it's making these connections, and then it's presenting them in this kind of very dynamic presentation of collection objects that allows you to kind of move through the space of collections. You kind of need to see it to experience it. And there's a link there to where I'm getting some of these examples from. This is another example that is giving you an indication. So this represents how the collection is made up from a topic standpoint. So the larger the image, the larger the number of collection objects related to that, that term. So you can see for this museum, the largest proportion of the collection is uniforms. Second largest is street photography. Third is schools. And then there's others, and you can see going down here. So it's one way of just getting this very good, very elegant picture of what the collection and how it's made up of. This one is just a kind of a visual, go by the, what looks interesting. You can kind of zoom in and zoom out and purely select more information based on the visual representation of a collection object. And then this one is just this kind of interesting kind of infographic approach, which has a timeline, kind of tells you how things are broken up. And it's as much a kind of research tool as it is a way of discovering the collection objects. Again, a link here if you're interested in finding out more of those. I talked about search engine optimization. You may have heard of the term SEO. So SEO is about how do you raise the profile when we think about online search engines. So Bing, Google, whatever it is, how do you work with how that search engine works to raise the profile of what you're doing? And these are the key things, right? So we talked earlier about metadata. Keywords and metadata that the general public would use to discover your collection are key issues here. Creating more incoming traffic to your websites. Google, particularly, Google is probably the primary referrer. So most of your traffic to your collection, to your website, to your collections website is probably coming from Google. And so Google will give you preference to your website if it is mobile fluent, right? So if it is designed to be mobile, Google knows that more people are online using a mobile device than a desktop. And so even if you think that your audience is primarily connecting with you on a desktop, you do need to have a mobile fluent website. Structured content. Google loves structured content. The way the internet works now, increasingly, if you search for something, you'll see that the first results are really answering a question that it thinks you've asked. And if there's a way to structure your content to help Google figure out how to answer questions for the part of the users. And then these are some other key things to raise the profile of your collection. And a lot of these have key implications for your collections management system, right? So having robust fields in your collections management for metadata, having the tools to be able to assign metadata to collection objects or to artist information is a key requirement for a collections management system. Meta titles and meta description tags, those kind of hidden things in a collections management, on a website really need to be supported in a collections management system. And then there are other techniques around, you can pay to be ranked on Google, and then really looking at how people are using your collection to inform the resources that you apply to either doing interpretive content or whatever it might be. Social media is a great way to raise attention. I'm going to skip through some of these things. There's a couple of things I wanted to talk about that really are coming down the line. The Met have a very interesting way of presenting groups of objects, which is curator selected. My favorite one is called Bad Hair, which is just a collection of 12 objects of paintings and sculpture of people who are clearly having a bad hair day. I highly recommend you click that link and go to that that website. Another, when we think about emerging audiences, right, and younger audiences, how do we connect with them? There's some great examples coming out now where institutions are really trying to do this great job of contextualizing an exhibition, for example. And I'm actually going to go to this one because this is a fantastic example of how to draw in young audiences, right? So this was a Medici exhibition that the Met put on, 16th century portraiture. How do you connect that to the social media generation, young kids? This is a fantastic primer for this exhibition. So it talks about building your brand. It talks about the influencer, how influencers are creating their brands, and it all puts it in the context of Medici portraiture, right? So Medici portraits were just like us when we take a selfie, right? We're positioning ourselves, maybe on Zoom, we're positioning some books, behind us that we want you to think that we've read. It's exactly the same for Medici portraits. And this was hugely popular in not only attracting attention to the exhibition, but also as a primer to create interest in Medici portraits. It resulted in a huge increase in attendance to the exhibition, and also a huge decrease in the average age of exhibition attendees. So you can see here, again, this is maybe using IIIF. Again, it's talking about things in the background from the context of a Zoom call. I highly recommend you take a look at that. A lot of institutions are providing virtual visits, and this is, again, I encourage you to check out this. It has a very elegant interface that allows you to navigate the National Gallery in London. You can pick up objects, you can turn them around, you can see them in 3D, you can do things with them virtually that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do in an actual museum, obviously. TikTok, if you're looking to connect your collection to younger generation, TikTok is one of the fastest growing social media platforms. This is a great example of a curator. She has 400,000 followers. She's had 10 million likes, fantastic numbers when we think about providing access and exposing our collection to audiences. She does some very funny TikTok. I don't know if anybody is on TikTok. If you're not on TikTok, please don't download it. It will be the end of your spare time. It's a complete mind drug, so don't do it. But there are some very good things on there. I wanted to show you this one. These are a couple of kind of virtual narratives, kind of storytelling around collection objects. These both come from the Getty, and these, one thing I wanted to point out here is these are being increasingly designed for the mobile audience, right? So, you have what's known as the infinite scroll, right? So you're on your mobile phone and you're on a website and you're just, with your thumb, you're just scrolling down. And so this takes you on a journey around the Mesopotamia collection that the Getty has. But all I'm doing is scrolling. And so as I'm scrolling, and again, this is using that IIIF technology I told you about. So you're linking pop-up text, you can link pop-up images, you can create regions of interest. But as I'm scrolling, so it's taking you on a journey on this, which is essentially a mosaic, glazed ceramic. So as I keep scrolling, we're going in and out, we're coming in to see some detail, and then you'll see in a moment, it will So it's kind of done an introduction. So it's kind of like, coming into an exhibition gallery, you have some interpretive, you have some wall text to kind of set the scene. And this is really doing the same thing. So now we're actually in the context of the exhibition, and we're going to go through and discover some of these objects. And so these allow us now, as we're scrolling, to kind of really zoom in, rotate around, look around, get some interpretive copy, see some detail, some close looking. This takes you through the entire exhibition. I highly recommend that you check this out. It's fantastically engaging. There's a really interesting what's called a discovery wizard at the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands. And basically it takes you, it's a little like, if anybody's familiar with Tinder, it's kind of a little bit like Tinder. It kind of asks you some questions about things. So here it's asking you to make a selection. If you were going on a holiday, what kind of holiday would it be? Do you love roses and daisies? Do you love candlelight? What are your favorite colors? Maybe a place that you are very affectionate with, and then in another life, I was a clown. And so it's asking you questions. So you go through this process, and then it presents you with, I won't log in right now, but you can do this for yourself. It presents you with a selection of objects from the collection based on the answers that you gave to those questions. A lot of institutions increasingly are using interactive games, really trying to reach down to the younger generation, teens, maybe pre-teens, to create these interactive experiences that really provide a deeper connection to your collection objects. We're kind of stepping out of the realms of now that might be supported within a collections management system, but they speak to this need to be able to connect collections management systems to more advanced systems that can present some of these more engaging, in-depth treatments of collection objects. In terms of accessibility, a couple of examples I wanted to share with you here. From a very broad accessibility standpoint, if you're interested in the decolonization initiative that's certainly happening in the US and in other countries, this treatment here from Museum and Next is kind of a summary of everything that's going on. I wanted to show you this little video. So this is a multilingual kind of dynamic wall label, essentially, and it's triggered by the actual ticket that you go in the museum, right? The ticket has this little RFID chip in it, and as you go past these text displays, these dynamic text displays, it'll change to whatever language you've purchased in your ticket when you purchase that ticket. This is web accessibility, accessibility for people with disabilities, particularly sight, particularly sound, who may have challenges there. There are some plugin solutions at the front end that allow you to create greater accessibility with your collection. There are standards and guidelines now. None of these, as far as I'm aware, these are kind of requirements if you're building a new website. None of these are baked into some of those online modules that collections management vendors are presenting right now. So there is a real disconnect there. And then there are some very emerging requirements to serve, particularly NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection Return Restitution Act, which is some federal requirements around how you think and talk about some of your collection objects certainly from a repatriation standpoint. I have the links to these things here if you're interested in finding out more about accessibility. I talked about open access earlier, right? That kind of visionary, actually bold and visionary layer. So this is certainly one of the more recent institutions that are doing open access. So what is the point of doing open access? So I'm actually going to click on this link and take you to, so this is the Cleveland Museum of Art in the US, and this is their dashboard, which is tracking, I talked at that kind of right-hand level of visionary and revolutionary around looking to data to help you understand how people are using your collection. So look at some of these numbers here. So so this open access, making your collection images and information generally available, right? And there are some various techniques. You can either do it on your website, you can use Wikipedia, you can use Wikimedia to do these things. But these are the numbers. So since doing this project, Cleveland Museum of Art has had 5 million collection online views, much higher than they had to their website previously, certainly their collection. But then by making these things available, uploading them to Wikipedia, they've had over 240 million views of their collection objects, right? It's a stunning amount of interest in a collection. And something like Wikipedia is a great referrer to drive traffic back to your website, again, to gain attention, to build your profile. And you can see there's some really interesting things around what is most viewed. So you can see here Chinese art. That's probably to be expected if you've made this stuff kind of globally available. The Chinese online population is huge. A lot of interest in that even in the West. So you can use this kind of metrics and analysis to inform decisions around what you do with your collection. It's very, not only are you getting this huge increase in interest in your collection, but you're also getting information about what is perceived by the public to be most interesting to them. Okay. So let's talk about AI. You must be getting the headlines around ChatGPT that we are in the US, I assume. It's just completely upending the whole higher education and education world. I briefly mentioned this earlier, Art Explorer, which was a Metropolitan Museum initiative, using AI to create all these connections in your collection and provide people with a kind of navigable way of interacting with them. There's a link here if you're interested in finding more about that particular project. I wanted to share this with you. You know, when we think about how do you help your audiences understand what may be less accessible works. In this case, this is Salvador Dali. This is actually an AR experience at the Salvador Dali Museum, which is trying to help you understand what Dali was trying to achieve with this painting. So this is actually an AR experience. You know, you consume it on a mobile phone, you hold your mobile phone up to the picture, and the picture through your phone comes to life. You may have seen some of these emerging image generation tools. So these images don't exist in reality, but you can ask an artificial intelligent image generator to, you know, create a portrait, recreate, you know, Jan Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring as Mark Zuckerberg as the subject, Snoop Dogg as Shakespeare. You can also do these other interesting things around taking an image and recreating it with some other set of images. So, for example, this a kind of a classic picture of somebody shooting a bullet through an apple. But you can tell an AI image generator to recreate that image in the style of a vase of flowers. And so you can see that kind of similarity there. There's any number of these online image generators available, and increasingly they're being used to kind of create interest in kind of visual arts. I don't know if you're familiar with this, the next Rembrandt. This was to use an AI image generation engine to recreate, based on all of Rembrandt's body of work, to recreate his next painting. So this painting on the left does not exist. This was recreated from a computer using AI and virtually indistinguishable from a real Rembrandt painting. This was not painted by anyone. This was generated. It's quite extraordinary. I don't know whether you're seeing, thinking about the metaverse. I don't know whether that is starting to enter into social commentary over where you are. NFTs, generating digital surrogates or generative images to generate revenue. I'll just say one thing about the metaverse. Kind of where we are with the metaverse right now, it will be this virtual environment. It's similar to where we were in the late 90s, early 2000s, when we were having conversations about, should we have a website? As a museum, should we have a website? Soon you'll be having conversations about, should we be in the metaverse? And at some point, there will be no discussion. If you're not in the metaverse, then you will be seen as behind the times. So something to look out for. This is probably the most concerning from a collection interpretation standpoint. ChatGPT. If you haven't used it yet, I would recommend that you go to ChatGPT and ask it to write you a wall label for an object in your collection. Do it. You will be shocked at how good it is. A colleague of mine who runs an art history postgraduate study course did a comparative study of, actually this was in Cleveland, so Cleveland Museum's wall labels and ChatGPT generated wall labels, and 10 out of 10 times the choice, it was a blind study, the choice was the ChatGPT version of the wall label. Remarkably worrying, right? But not only can you ask it to write you a wall label, you can give it more information about, well, not only you could say, and, write it in French or write it in Spanish or Finnish or Swahili. I mean, pretty much any language, it will reinterpret it for you. You can ask it to provide a context for today. You can ask it anything and it will do it. It is quite extraordinary. If you want to be worried about the future of interpretive content, go to see ChatGPT. And I actually asked it here is, what impact will it have on interpreting museum collections? It says, I can enhance accessibility, I can supplement human interpretation, I can provide multilingual support, I can personalize it to you, and it's going to save you time as well. Think of all those times when you spend writing a wall label with all those different people involved and how long it takes. This will probably become a service. People will provide mobile services where you can ask it anything and it is going to tell you whatever you want. Quite concerning. Okay. Creating interest in your collection is a journey, just a high-level thing about creating those moments of connection to your collection, right? Which might be just one object. So, for example, that Salvador Dali, doing an interpretation of one Salvador Dali experience like that is going to help you look at other Salvador, is going to make you look at other Salvador Dali paintings in a different way to try and understand what was going on. So oftentimes you don't have to do this large-scale interpretive strategy to get interest in your collection. You just need to pick a few choice ones, invest more resources in just one thing, but then provide people access to the other works. So that strategy for Salvador Dali was clearly use this particular work to create the interest and help people understand how he constructed his paintings, and then provide this entree to all his other works of art. Let's not worry about that. That's way too complicated. So that's a QR code to, we have about 10 minutes left. We have a QR code, or I think EFRAT is probably going to distribute 2 links to the presentations that you've seen today. So now I'm going to force you to ask me some questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to demand that somebody ask me a question or make a comment.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes.
Just turning on my cam for a second. Hi, my name is Hamutal. I am advising the forum on collection management systems. The Israeli market is constructed of approximately 60 museums, 60 to 80 museums. A couple of them are very big and the rest are tiny, small to tiny.
Okay.
And what you've shown here is spectacular, amazing opportunities to use your collection. But yeah, I think what the forum really needs is a first advice on how do we start? Where do we go? Most museums don't even have a normal CMS. So what would your advice? Yeah, you go.
So yeah, and we deal with we work with volunteer-only museums, right? So the strategy is not to figure it all out at once, right? So the strategy is, how do you go, define a strategy. At some point, we want to be here with I would recommend collaboratively coming up with what is a baseline that we want everybody to achieve. Right. So understanding that large ones, they have massive resources, it's not really about them. It's about what is an acceptable baseline that we should get everybody to start with. What does that look like? Is that, for some, that might be Google Sheets or Excel, right? But even if it's that, there are ways to organize that so that you are preparing yourself at some point to move into a managed domain. Right. So if you say now, I wouldn't recommend a small museum, if it doesn't have the resources, don't get a collections management system, right? Just apply a bunch of rules and rigor and guidelines to how you are thinking about collections management information, understanding that at some point you're going to want to move it into what I would refer to as a managed domain-specific environment, so a CMS. But there are plenty of tools out there now that you could say, okay, we want to get everybody to a base level of cataloging, which might be, if you're familiar with Dublin Core, as a classification of data. It's like, our baseline is using maybe some online, like Airtable, which is kind of, it's a little like, do you use FileMaker? Because some institutions may use FileMaker Pro. No? Okay, forget that. It's an online kind of slightly more advanced spreadsheeting tool, right? So you could say collectively, we're going to create an environment where it really just looks like a slightly more advanced Excel spreadsheet. But we have all made this commitment to hit this certain base level of information and cataloging. And I would say that's knowing that you're going to get up here. I think you've got to figure out a way to help all boats rise. So if you have this environment where you have, let's say you have 40 museums who are adopting a baseline standard of cataloging, of thinking about their data in a way that at some point we know somebody could just come in and scoop it all up, right? So that's where I would start. At the same time, I would be having conversations with some of the emerging cloud native collections management systems about this and say, this is where we want to get to in maybe 3-4 years time, and say to them, or find one who is going to kind of meet you there, right? So if in 3 or 4 years time, you have 40 institutions that have their collections information, it's fully fielded data, it's in an Excel spreadsheet, that's fine. At least it is fielded and it's not in, this may help you. You may be more advanced than you think, right? I'm talking to a very large university museum right now, and they are responsible for supporting 200 different collections across 9 different campuses. Most of their collection information, the majority of it, is in Word documents, right? That's not usable. In a Word document, how do I programmatically parse out that data, right? The first thing this is a big multi-billion-dollar museum, right? But they haven't invested resources in it. And so they've got this. So that our advice to them is you got to get a first step is you got to get everybody out of Word docs, right? Just into Excel, because then at least it's fielded. Then at least an online service can pull that information programmatically into it. It's going to take them, years. Did that help?
May I just comment one more thing, because I'm loving your idea of cataloging in a unified manner, as Dublin Core, as libraries would use Mark 21 and so forth. And I have been wondering in the past few months, some people would know why I'm wondering that, why museums are not using, or at least museums in Israel, I don't know about the world, are not using a unified cataloging system, the same as libraries that are way more advanced in that matter. So I'm loving that idea, and I would advise my fellow colleagues to seriously think about this.
Because then you have strength in numbers, right? So then if you have this unified cataloging standard and unified format, super easy to then, en masse to, it gives you leverage, right? The more there you are, the greater leverage you have in talking to a provider who can then help you move from that kind of fielded environment to a managed environment.
And also to build also to build power as a group here, because so many small collections would only have power if they unify together into one big group.
Yeah, but
amazing. Thank you.
Maybe after we wrote the standard for collection management, the next step is to write a document about standard for reputation.
I mean, I think as I'm hearing you speak, I think your goal isn't to your goal isn't to pick a collections management system. Your goal is to get your data and cataloging straight first.
Yeah.
I think, could I add to Hamutal? First of all, Nick, this is amazing. You did a great job with this overview. My name is Alison Kupiecki. I'm from the Israel Museum. I wanted to add to what Hamutal said, that I think that the idea of using either CDWA, some kind of a schema, or the Lido schema is what we've been aiming for, because we're working with Europeana, so we've been using that. And the second thing that you spoke about, which I think is really very important to make use of, it's free taxonomy using Wikidata. So if you have an artist name and you look on Wikidata and that Q number, the number of the term, that's already a way to share information between institutions in the future. So I would add that to the recommendations, that we have standardized list of terms, specifically artist names, but it could be anything. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you're very welcome. It was a pleasure. And so, you'll solve a lot of problems with, particularly, if you're sharing, if you have this fielded data, you can then go in and, clean up, control all your vocabulary, control all your taxonomy. I mean, it's a fantastic opportunity to have this much more unified approach. And maybe, if you can demonstrate that level of organization and data consistency, maybe that gives you greater leverage in talking to the ministry for, more of a countrywide approach to providing, exposing your collections to the world, right? So rather than these kind of individual ones, you have this, kind of leadership initiative of, because I don't know of another country that is providing access. The UK is trying to do this right now. I think they're trying to bring together this kind of unified collections view from across, and they have a much different funding model. So the resources are beginning to come available to be able to do this. But I don't know another one.
Canada did it with the chin.
Yes, you're right. Although try and act, from a internal collections management standpoint, yes. From an external providing access, it's like a unified cultural destination for your collective history, right? And culture. Any other questions? Come on. You know you want to. Sure. So, Efrat, you're going to send out links to those two presentations, yes?
Yeah. Yeah, I will share them. Okay. So, Nik, thank you very much for your knowledge and information, sharing it with us. It was very interesting.
Excellent. It was a pleasure. So tune in next month for digital asset management systems, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.